This is the fourth tiebreak game in the World Championship match between Ding Liren and Jan Nepomniachtchi. Remember, the first three games in the tiebreak were drawn. If you haven't seen my video on that, then do check that out. But this is the fourth rapid play game. So Jan Nepomniachtchi playing white, Ding Liren playing black, and both players stuck to their guns. E4, E5. We've seen Ding defend the black side of the Spanish throughout this match. And once again, Nepo goes for D3, which keeps more tension in the position compared to, say, the standard martial gambit. So here we go. We've seen A3, we've seen C3 before, and Nepo plays A4. So he's repeating the line that he played in the second tiebreak game with A4, and then this idea of H3 and bishop E3. Ding plays in exactly the same way. Knight A5, the bishop came back to A2 and he took on A4. Now, in that second tiebreak game, Nepo played bishop D2 and got a good position. But there were improvements for black, so no doubt Ding had that in mind to do something different. But instead of bishop D2, Nepo went for knight C3, which is also a very reasonable move. Rook B8, so Ding repeats his strategy of trying to get some counterplay against the pawn on B2. And here Nepo played a very risky move. He played bishop B1. Well, very risky is perhaps too much, but it's certainly when you put your bishop where it's blocked by all three pawns, then it looks a little bit unorthodox. It's not strictly necessary to play like this. One could play queen c1 to defend the pawn on b2. But bishop b1 is very interesting. But it has been seen before, actually. Previously, for example, we've seen a game with c5 and then knight takes a4. But Ding went for queen e8. So guarding that pawn. And now b3. So white is exploiting the pin. c5 and knight takes a4. So white has recovered the pawn. The problem is that the pawn has come to b3, and that really makes this bishop look like a terrible piece with all those pawns on light squares. So although black's structure doesn't look very promising with that lone isolated pawn on a6, it's hard for white to take advantage of the fact that this is a weak pawn because of that bishop on b1. Knight c3 threatens the pawn, so a5. Knight d2. So the knight swings over. Bishop e6 and knight c4. Now, Ding decides to play actively here. He obviously didn't want to be tied down to defending that pawn. And white's knights do look very well placed here. Still got to solve the problem with that bishop. But in any case, Ding decided that he wanted to break out with d5. So an exchange. And here bishop d2. So Nepo is still gunning for the pawn on a5. Knight takes, bishop takes. And now a really double-edged move. Both players playing very interesting chess, actually. First Nepo playing like this, with his bishop shut in, but wanting to take that pawn. And now Ding decided to give up that bishop. The light square bishop, very important piece. Now, if we could magically just drop that light squared bishop on let's say d5, then white would have a clear advantage. Those light squares are so weak. That bishop would be a monster. But that bishop is shut behind the pawns. Now, could it creep out here to a4? I mean, that would certainly improve the position of the piece. Not easy to get there, actually. But anyway, first of all, bishop d8 by Ding. Just guarding that pawn, which could be useful. Bishop d2 from Nepo. Right, so he's looking to improve the situation of that bishop. Instead of going around this way, which could be a little tricky with the knight coming to d4, he's looking to play c3 and then maybe bring the bishop out like that. Bishop c7 and c3. Playing the pawn c3 also guards the d4 square. You don't really want to have to deal with the knight coming into d4 on that beautiful outpost. So if white has time, then this maneuver could be rather nice. You know, once that bishop improves. So Ding can't just sit there. Black needs to generate counterplay, and that's what he does with the pawn move f5. So we see this pawn duo rolling down the board, which could be rather good. So Nepo played rook e1. So this is directed against a possible break with e4. And, well, it can't be bad to put the rook opposite the queen. That's kind of a natural move. Rook d8 played. So that also feels very natural. Potentially black is going to break with e4, and why not put the rook opposite the bishop and the queen. Rook a2. So again, feels very natural to play like that. So the bishop is guarded, and when the queen comes out, queen e2. So this is, you know, kind of prophylaxis, these last two moves, the rook a2 and queen e2 against a potential e4. This is really black's big break. Playing a move like f4 doesn't look very nice because it just really weakens the e4 square. If black can play f3, that's another matter, but queen f3 could be played, and that looks really ugly. Now that bishop really doesn't look very good. So black really should be playing for e4. That's the only active plan, actually. So that's why Nepo is playing these moves, rook a2 and queen e2, stepping away from the d file. Queen d6. So the queen lines up here and on this diagonal as well. Therefore g3, making sure that e4 and queen h2 check doesn't happen. And Ding switches the rook to e8, so they look pretty good. He's building up to play e4. And here's a big moment in the game. Ding decides to break with pawn to e4. As I said, if black doesn't do that, it's not clear to me what he's doing. So, for example, he could play king h8, but that's just hesitating, really, and it does allow the queen in. You know, these endgames could be very promising for white once that bishop emerges. And, yeah, queen takes c5 is possible. So Ding decides to just go for it with e4, and that's a very human move. Incidentally, the computer likes knight e7, but that is not the kind of move you play in a rapid play game. The point is, I guess, to cover the d5 square. But moving backwards, blocking the rook, feels so unnatural. And I think it's very understandable that Ding went for e4. He's moving forward. He's trying to seize the initiative. Computer doesn't like the move. That's the funny thing. But to me, it just feels as though this is the move that black has been building up to playing, well, really over the last kind of 6 or 7 moves. Ever since black went in for this position and got in f5. So that's taken. And Ding played knight e5. So you can see these lines starting to open, and the knight finds a nice square, attacking the queen, attacking the pawn here. Now you can see why rook a2 was played to guard that bishop. And it's a tricky position, particularly when you're running short of time. Queen g2 feels like a very natural move. The computer prefers queen d1, which doesn't feel right, actually, to move the queen away from the king. Queen g2 is a much more human move. Now you've got to be careful, because if this is taken, then the bishop can leap out here, and this bishop, which has just been dead for a long time, really starts to come into its own. Knight d3, I think it's a good move from Ding. Bishop takes, queen takes. So, well, the problem of that bishop on b1 has been solved because it's managed to exchange itself off. E takes f5. Rook takes, bishop takes. So what's the score? The score is white is a pawn up. But it's a tricky situation. I mean, it seems to me that white's pieces aren't very well coordinated. The rook is under attack. This pawn has potential. In fact, the computer thinks that white is better after rook d2. Again, not a very human move. But it does seem as though this manages to activate quite nicely. But, I mean, whether white can win this position is another matter. But Nepo played, to my eyes, a much more natural move, keeping the rook on the A file, so making sure that pawn doesn't advance too far, protecting the bishop, protecting the back rank. Rook takes f5, so now material is even again. Bishop d2, so this bishop emerges from the back rank, and h6. And it feels as though the game is drifting towards a draw. Queen c6, rook f7, well, but Nepo is probing a little bit with the queen. Rook e1, and this activates the rook, so Ding has to be a little bit careful here. He tucked the king on h7. Bishop e3 threatens this pawn. And here it just seemed like, well, things are heading for a draw. So after bishop e5, I fully expected Nepo just to exchange on c5, and, well, this is heading for a draw very quickly. But instead, he kept probing with queen e8, and this starts to get very tricky. You can see the queen looks at the rook, although it's guarded at the moment. But the queen is also looking at the bishop. And black's king is a little bit more insecure compared to white's king. There are 3 pawns in front of white's king. Only 2 pawns here. And there's kind of an open window. So I can understand why Nepo thought, right, time to just probe a little bit. There's no need to cut to a draw. So, for example, after queen takes, now that hits the rook, but then rook c1 hits the queen, and, well, basically the queen can't protect both those pieces. If queen b3, then you play queen takes bishop. So black has to be a little bit careful. Bishop takes c3. This is a really brave move from Ding, because after rook c1, that queen is in severe danger of being overloaded. And Ding was short on time. Ding had less time than Nepo here. And suddenly, there's a bit of a nasty pin. The queen is looking at the rook. There's an open window towards black's king on this b1 h7 diagonal. This is very tricky indeed. Perhaps let's just stop for a moment. How do you play here with black? This is not easy, particularly when you've got just seconds to play it in. I mean, Ding had, I can't remember exactly, he had a few minutes left. Maybe 2 or 3 minutes at this point. But he couldn't hang around here. He had to play pretty quickly. Okay, so black to play. What are you going to do? Cheers. Well, he found the only move. He played rook f6, just nudging the rook away from the queen. And here's a little trick. Nepo played queen d7 here, but if bishop d2, take care. In fact, rook f3 is possible. That just about hangs on, but queen d4 is the move. And this leads to a draw by perpetual. But instead of that, we had queen d7 from Nepo, just keeping the queen active, making sure that black's queen doesn't come to d3. And yeah, if the queen steps out of the way, then there's queen d3 check, picking up the bishop. So black's position looks a little bit loose here. And playing with very little time on the clock, this is tricky for black. But Ding found an excellent move, queen e2. Very tricky. So obviously rook takes c3, queen e1 check. I say obviously. With hindsight, it's obvious. So white can't take the bishop. Bishop takes c5. How about that one? Well, bishop e1 starts to get very tricky with three pieces starting to attack the king. In fact, queen a7 just about hangs on, protecting here, but even this looks a bit tricky. I can understand why Nepo decided not to take that pawn. Instead he played queen d5, which looks like very nice centralization. Now, the black's pieces still aren't very well coordinated. The king is still looking out where there's an open window. And I fully expected Ding just to compromise here and play bishop d4. Just forcing exchanges. And after this, well, this one is going to drift towards a draw. Even if this a pawn is picked up, then 3v2 is a pretty easy draw. But no, Ding did not simplify. That's the obvious move. Bishop d4 is the safe move. Instead, he played bishop b4, taking the bishop away from this diagonal. Now that is risky. So once again, bishop c5 was possible, but bishop e1, well, that, when you're short of time, you just kind of think, oh, that looks a bit tricky. So Nepo checked on e4. Now, once again, Ding could just compromise here and just move the king back. This rook can't get into the game, and actually the best that white has is just to give a draw by perpetual check. But incredibly, Ding played rook g6. Now that is really brave. Or is it foolish? It looks very odd to self-pin in this way. Black's pieces are not well coordinated. I suppose the good news is this bishop protects the pawns and is protected itself, but still, that is a very brave move to play rook g6. And, Nepo is still okay here. Could maybe play rook c2. You could play h4 like this. And should be okay for white. One feels that, well, this pawn is going to be taken and it'll be even. It's hard for white to squeeze anything more from that one. Likewise black. Nepo played queen f5, which it feels okay to maintain this pin. But Ding played c4. Now it gets tricky. This pawn advancing, and perhaps queen d3 coming. h4, so white wants to play h5. Queen d3, I think Nepo had underestimated this move c4. And now it's swinging in black's favour. The queen steps back. Rook f6. Queen g4. c3. Uh-oh. This looks pretty nice. Very pleasant for black when everything is protected here. And the queen has found its way to the perfect diagonal, covering the king. Rook d1. And this is a great move by Ding. He finds a really precise move here, which allows the pawns to advance again. Queen g6, excellent move. Now, he could have played queen f5. Could have moved the queen somewhere else. But queen g6 is really good because if the queen swings to c4, here's the point. The queen on g6 can protect the rook. And then the pawn is going to advance again. So that's a key move, rook c6 in many different positions. So queen c8 played. So Nepo looking for a desperate counterattack on the 8th rank. But rook c6, that really important move. And here, in fact, Ding could have played c2. It's a good move. Because if the rook goes to d8, in fact, it's possible just to do this. And then play queen c6, and the king is safe here. That queen covers the e8 square. Now, white could fall back with rook c1, but this must be losing. But instead, Ding, short of time, I think he was down to about a minute on the clock. He didn't want to calculate. He played rook d6. This is a mistake, actually. Although, again, a very human move, a very understandable move. You want to try and simplify when you've got these lovely passed pawns. But in fact, now it's problematic. It's hard for black to make progress here, incredibly, because there's this little push here which is going to upset the queen and corral black's king. So Ding went for queen b1 and then played a4. So everything is protected on the queen side, but that king is looking lonesome on h7. And Nepo immediately exploits that with bishop d4. The counterattack starts. This is tricky. And here, Ding with black makes a blunder. a3. Well, it feels very natural. But now Nepo was actually lower on time than Ding. And Nepo was down to his final seconds. And he missed a great shot. He played queen c7, threatening a checkmate. Well, that's a very understandable move when you haven't got a lot of time. But he could have played bishop takes pawn. Incredibly, this should save the game. And here's why. If black marches on, threatening to get a queen, then bishop d4, simple move, threatens queen f7. And if queen g6, queen takes pawn, the immediate danger has passed, and then white is going on the counterattack and actually has a winning position there. And if king takes bishop, it's impossible for black to escape these checks. You can try very hard. You can try and run across to the other side of the board like this. Well, let's try this one. Don't go to g4. That's actually checkmate. Sorry, not that one. You can try this and try and run across the board. Incredibly, there is no hiding place. If that king could march to b2, that would be different. But white makes sure that the king doesn't have access. And yeah, watch out here. That wouldn't be too bright. Dropping the queen. And this is just a draw. It's incredible. But listen, bishop takes g7. you don't find this with seconds on the clock. You just assume that the king is going to escape the perpetual, but incredibly it can't. Nepo played queen c7, threatening mate, but after queen g6, it's pretty desperate. And the game went like this. Queen c4, c2. The bishop came back because, well, with the bishop covering here, that was actually threatened. h5, that stops white from this playing this upsetting move h5. Bishop e5, so that bishop comes to this diagonal. Once the pieces are in these positions, covering black's king and supporting the pawns, then it really is over. Here, Nepo played a very desperate move, g4. Let's just have a quick look what might happen on king g2. The bishop comes to b2. Well, that's pretty nice because it covers this one. And slowly but surely, black is going to creep in there, basically. But g4 played, and after this, well, now, apart from stopping these pawns advancing, white's king is in trouble as well. Here's a nice move, a2. That was taken, bishop f4. And here, Jan Nepomniachtchi resigned. Ding becomes world chess champion. Let's just very quickly see what could happen. If white takes, then queen takes, and you get a new queen, and there's no stalemate there, by the way. So yes, bishop takes f4. That was the final position. Ding Liren is the new world chess champion. He's 30 years old. He has been over 2,800 in the past. A few years ago, he had a 100-game streak where he was unbeaten, which was pretty incredible. I remember at that time in sort of 2018, 2019, he did seem to be the most likely challenger for Magnus Carlsen, actually. And they had some fantastic struggles. I remember there was a rapid play event in Scotland where I was on site commentating, and Carlsen only just scraped through there. Ding was a really worthy opponent for him. It was around about that time in 2019 where we thought, yeah, Ding could be the challenger. But well, I think the pandemic really was a setback for him. He was restricted in his movements and couldn't play a lot of chess. But, well, through some good fortune, he managed to get into the candidates and managed to qualify. And, well, it's been a fascinating match. Lots of ups and downs. I think what's been great about this World Championship match is that it showed that one doesn't have to play in this super safe way to actually compete at the very highest level. Ding has been really enterprising with his opening choices, particularly with white, put a lot of pressure on Nepo, and well, finally it has paid off. And wow, that final rapid play game, he showed incredible bravery. Both players did, actually. So yeah, congratulations to Ding. For Nepo, well, he will really rue his chances in the classical games. Of course, the tiebreak to some extent is a bit of a lottery, but it's in those classical games, games 12 and 14, where Nepo had the chance to finish things off. But I'm afraid he couldn't hold his nerve, and that's what Ding did right at the conclusion. Thank you very much for joining me during these last few weeks. I hope you've enjoyed the coverage. And if you want to support the channel, well, do subscribe. You'll get instant notifications for when I post new videos. And if you want to support the channel on patreon.com/PowerPlayChess, then do check out the extras you get. Videos, newsletters, test games, Anyway, you do check it out, patreon.com/PowerPlayChess. Thanks very much for watching.